So it's my great pleasure to now introduce to the stage Jillian York and Mathana. Jillian is the Electronic Frontier Foundation's Director for International Freedom of Expression. Her work examines state and corporate censorship and its impact on culture and human rights, with a focus on historically marginalized communities. Mathana is a tech ethicist, human rights advocate, and researcher who explores the connection between emerging technology and social change. Thank you both, and please welcome them.
Thank you, Enrique. So I've worked for a long time on the issue of content moderation and freedom of expression, traditionally more in the centralized platform space, but obviously decentralized platforms are taking over, and so at EFF we're also focused on how these issues and content moderation specifically are impacted on decentralized platforms, and it's still an ongoing topic. Are you clicking? Yes. Okay, awesome. So I'm going to start with a little story, a little background. Woodstock, 1969. I brought this into the talk because my mom was actually there, and I grew up hearing a lot of her stories about what that experience was like. She was very open about it, very open about the drugs, watching, I think her favorite was watching Jimi Hendrix while on acid. And this was a topic that, wasn't taboo in my household, even though I knew that in broader society, growing up in the late 80s and early 90s, it still was, definitely. And so why are we bringing Woodstock into this, and why Woodstock and TikTok? Well, so I've thought about this in the context, and Mathana and I have had long conversations about the ways in which authority figures, and not just parents, but the state and platforms themselves, particularly centralized platforms, are making decisions about what young people can do and see online in ways that are sort of unprecedented from previous spaces, but not really. Click. I have the clicker. I'm sorry. How do I didn't get instructions down. Thank you. Awesome. Apologies for the weird image, but some of you might remember this. I don't know how common it was internationally, but I see people from all over the place in this room. So, like I said, not entirely unprecedented. In 1985 in the US, the Parents Resource Music Center, which was a politically motivated organization, Tipper Gore, Al Gore's wife, was the head of this, but involved a lot of parents, started making decisions about what kids could listen to, and slapping these labels on a bunch of music, which then deterred parents from allowing their children to access these types of music. And in fact, I remember going into a shop, trying to buy an album, and being told that I couldn't do so because I was too young. Of course, I just got my parents, who were pretty cool, to buy it for me. But nevertheless, this, in my my experience or my recollection, was kind of the onslaught of this sort of culture, at least when I was growing up. Interestingly enough, I just learned yesterday that Tom Morello from Rage Against the Machine, his mother actually founded a counter-organization at that time called Parents for Rock and Rap. Thought that was the coolest thing ever. Some of you might have already known that. I did not. But anyway, there was still pushback against this, just as there is now. But sorry, I had to bring this one into it. This is from one of the Woodstock 99 documentaries, bringing it all back to Woodstock again. One of the things that was talked about in one of those documentaries that really resonated with me was the ways in which the cultural norms had shifted from the 60s to the 90s. We had this open, free love perspective, the things that my parents talked about with me, to a sort of really destructive thing. And I know it doesn't automatically kind of connect to what we're talking about, but I do think that for me, this is where that culture kind of shifts again, and where we see this, what was originally a festival meant to promote love and peace and freedom and openness, becomes this real capitalist horror show where prices are getting jacked up on water day by day. People are, I don't know if you've seen the documentary, I won't get into some of the more disgusting details, but as you see a porta potty being lit on fire, this was something that actually happened, and there was a lot of rage against that. So where am I going with this? Let's bring it to the internet. This is an old blog page. It's one of the best examples I can find. It's from Qatar, but there are many such examples of this. this is where I started to work on the question of freedom of speech online. And this was kind of the early days of the ways in which websites were being restricted before social media. So kind of censorship 1.0 on the web. And we've seen this with China, we've seen this in the Middle East, but we've also seen it in a number of other places, including in Europe, often done quite sloppily, as I'm sure many of you remember. But this, again, before social media, then we get to what happens with the ways in which platforms are restricted. And instead of seeing these sloppy blog pages, which are sometimes easily circumvented with VPNs or with Tor or what have you, we have this sort of disappearance of online content. And that's what I've worked on for so long and what I kind of want to focus on right now before we get into the more decentralized side of things. So early social media, or the kind of mid-social media era, early Web 2.0, we see these platforms being promoted as places for democratic change, as places for connection. I think you might remember Meta or Facebook at the time's early motto was making the world more open and connected. Not exactly true. And shortly after this era, 2011, what we saw was a shift towards placing more and more restrictions. The community standards on Facebook actually didn't come out until after this, until mid-2011, where we start to see more restrictions on sexual content, on nudity, on drugs, on things like hate speech, which maybe we want restricted, but on lots of things that I don't agree with. And so where are we now with this? Unfortunately, this is happening on centralized and decentralized platforms. We're seeing more and more restrictions on things that are sometimes, on things that are legal. So in the UK, we hear the phrase awful but lawful. In Europe, we see things like, harms, online harms. We hear these different phrases being used everywhere. We're seeing an era of age verification, of other restrictions being placed by states. Again, some of which I don't have a huge problem with. I think there are good elements to things like the DSA, but then there are a lot of regulations in the US, in the UK, in Australia, and elsewhere that are meant to restrict things from young people's views or even from adults' views that I think that we need as a society to be able to see. So this was a recent report from the European Sex Workers Alliance. There's many such examples, but this was a case where sex workers are being restricted from platforms, not for the content that they post. So this isn't a thing where platforms are going against, say, illegal sales of bodies, for example, but rather individuals are being restricted from these platforms even when they're posting normal things about their everyday lives. And this is being done through back channeling between companies, through collaborations with platforms and payment processors. It's an excellent report. I recommend it. This is from April of this year. Another example of this, so getting from sex to drugs, or also sex in this case, reproductive health is one of the most censored things online these days, and we're unfortunately seeing this across a lot of platforms, including in some cases more decentralized platforms, because of government requests. But in the US, where Roe v. Wade was overturned, and we've seen states try to restrict access to Plan C or abortion pills or whatever you want to call them, mifepristone, what we're seeing is not just the sale of those things being restricted, which in some cases may be unlawful, but we're also seeing grassroots information sharing being restricted. And Meta, for example, and again, talking about centralized platforms, Meta has actually said to Human Rights Watch that they don't restrict that content, but we're working on a project with a group called Repro Uncensored, so this is a partnership between EFF and that group, and we've been getting people's individual stories about this, screenshots, examples, cases where they've tried to appeal, and what we are seeing, and we're hopefully going to be talking with some of these companies in a couple weeks, is the restriction of grassroots information sharing. The slides did get in the right order. And so that's just, another slide from that. But I'm going to turn it over to Mathana for the next bit.
Cool. Thank you. It's nice to be here with everybody today. Yeah, just wanted to provide another kind of another side of the coin to what Julian has said. Even taking a step back in history, and I think it's an interesting time and an inflection point now as we're talking about decentralized media and what is the future of even the W3 ecosystem. and also in the dawn of generative AI. So what does the next round of technology look like? Why is it being pioneered? Who's pioneering it? What are the motives that are driving the technological expansion? And I think it's an interesting time to think back now, particularly in the context of sex and drugs, to think about even the early days of the internet. Some of the pioneers of Silicon Valley were well known using LSD. Steve Jobs was a user of LSD. Some of the people that worked on the early microchips, person that made the computer mouse and other core technologies. And then if we fast forward even to the early days of Facebook, when Mark Zuckerberg sitting in that Harvard dorm room with, face match with the Winklevoss twins, but also then using this kind of technology to create, this hot or not platform. And so how even this university student was even thinking about had sex on his mind as he was pioneering a technology that one day would become one of the largest platforms. And so I think it's interesting to kind of think about how sex and drugs, or drugs and sex, have been a driver really in two of the technological evolutions that we've seen over the internet. And now thinking forward, what are some of the things that we want out of the kind of the decentralized platform? How can they evolve on the current Web 2.0 ecosystem, and how can it also give people access to new information in new ways? And just before I go further, this is a project that I've been involved in, and I think that just want to have also people thinking about, right now we talk a lot about social media, but I think even the web, the decentralized media ecosystem has given us a chance to even think about more like, what is transmissible information? And as there's more and more roadblocks and intermediary gatekeepers on social media where people are putting their content, I think it's going to be exciting to see what are the other platforms that are coming up to be able to provide architecture and infrastructure to be able to, let's say, bypass intermediary platforms, and perhaps even provide, in the case of Save by Open Archive, give you direct access to a server using a free to download lightweight app that allows you to basically plug in server credentials and be able to transfer mobile captured media directly to your own server instance. And I think as we're thinking about decentralized media, it's an important now time to ask, what do we want out of these platforms, and how can every new emerging economy and influence also be rooted in some sort of ethics? Do we need ethics? Is agnostic technology enough? Or do we want to be able to design platforms on an ethical basis? And to a certain extent, that ethics could be, the free flow of information, even going back to the early days of the internet, of saying, how can we have radical networking and connectivity? But we are at this point now, going back to social media, where there's more and more roadblocks coming up. Right now, there are a number of countries that have imposed restrictions on that are looking to impose age requirements on social media. Already, platforms generally say 13-year-olds, under 13s are not able to use a platform, but more and more this age is creeping up to 16 by governments. And while there are, I think there is a lot of cases for the unexamined or less, underexamined causalities on the mental health of young people, as the shift to more and more governments shifting to far right, there's also a lot of new roadblocks in education when it both comes to things like sex and responsible reproductive care, responsible sexual education, and also drugs as well. What are the safety? What are things to know to be able to engage in recreational drug use, or even use drugs as a form of medicine or a pathway towards enlightenment? And so I think it's going to be interesting to see kind of the pushback now, as perhaps public education is being defunded, and in places like the US, we're seeing a lot more people being homeschooled. Now, if there's going to be more roadblocks to young people being able to access online platforms, it's going to change the way that young people have access to healthy information. And going back to the idea of ethically rooted economies of influence, if harm reduction, if care are the things that we want to be able to design platforms to foster, I think it's going to be important that young people have access to information. And perhaps in the decentralized media space, there's going to be new ways, just like in the early days before social media, when Tumblr, but even going back to even GeoCities, and people were having their own kind of self-hosted instances. So maybe we can look back to say, how can we plan future iterations of social technologies based on the past? And so we are now at this inflection point. So the Minister of Digital Affairs for Denmark, which is going to be taking over the EU presidency, just said this a couple of weeks ago. And Denmark is now going to actually going to look to shape EU policy to be able to look on a EU-wide policy to increase this age of social media to 16. There's already a coalition of 5 or 6 governments that are looking into this, and so it's going to be interesting to see if there's going to be enough political capacity and capital within the the 27, 26 now after Brexit bloc to say, is 16? Are we going to have a new legal age with tobacco, like tobacco and alcohol? And so what I think is also interesting to think about where the EU is looking to put the onus on these sort of new age restrictions. Right now, as you'll see at the bottom, the current document is going to be at the age verification that's going to be at the device level. And so that's going to mean that perhaps Apple and Google that own these app stores are now going to kind of be the intermediary. So it's not even maybe even the platforms. It's not even other sort of. It's not going to be maybe the websites themselves access to this. It's not going to be age verification for different social platforms. But even at the device level, that also brings in like a lot of privacy, security concerns. They say they're going to try to do this without personally identifiable information, but the ways that it's going to, the technical challenges around this are these sort of the onuses that are going to be placed perhaps at the device level. What is this going to look like? Is it going to be AI to be able to, upload a photo that matches with the age verification software? How does this even look as far as the training data that's being used for that and the bias capacity there? So going actually to more of the decentralized media ecosystem, and I found this paper from last year. For folks that are interested in more of this topic, I recommend checking out this paper. And so even I mentioned in the last phrase, we can see that the European Commission is working, going to try to use the Digital Services Act to be one of the regulatory mechanisms. And so this paper looks actually at some of the shortcomings of the DSA and looks about actually kind of the very large online platforms was what the DSA was founded for. But when we get to things like the Fediverse and other decentralized platforms, the DSA really didn't have necessarily these platforms in mind. And so I think it's going to be interesting for people that are working on decentralized platforms where the onus and burden is going to be for things like age verification on smaller platforms. How might it get in the way of innovation and be able to put an onus on startups and on SMEs that are pioneering decentralized technologies in order to be beholden to a DSA, a regulatory framework that was designed essentially for these very large online platforms that have a lot of capacity and can deal a lot with legal compliance and other things. And so I think this quote is quite pressing from Sappho, poet from ancient Greece who lived 2,600 years ago. She wrote a lot about her longings for desires and her queerness and desire for her female lovers. But this was also very, she was really one of the pioneers. In fact, we say that the word lesbian from the island that she was from, Lesbos, and sapphic love, this love between women really is derived from her name. So she had this very outsized influence on even on modern society and linguistics. But I think this idea really of sex and drugs and exploration of self and body is important to remember that this is an age-old issue, that young people are going to have desires, going to have interests, going to want to explore. And how can new technologies be used as a way to enable, as I said, harm reduction and community care, and not be a cultural roadblock in the way to form healthy attitudes. And so, wrapping up, I think that some people may recognize from the 90s, perhaps when in the U.S. at least, when there was pay-per-view and even pornography on TV, but because there was still the terrestrial broadcast signals, one thing they would do is if the cable box was not unlocked, they would basically mask the signal of pornographic content with basically this squiggle vision. And so I think it's interesting now to think about, in the context of the device, the EU's regulation on perhaps device age verification, and thinking about how the remote control was something that perhaps parents could take away as far as to control access to content, and now thinking more about the kind of the smartphone as being this thing that young people have and even growing up with, but also now, it's now kind of states that are looking to impose this new requirements on people's smartphones. And I think now as we're designing new technologies and thinking about decentralized media, what is going to be the next, are there going to be new tools that are perhaps going to be able to be used to get in between people, information, and these next generation platforms? And so I think it's important, finally to say and think, always have a good reminder to say, what is the digital future that we want? And I think a lot of times we get caught up with business cycles and other things, but as we're designing platforms and innovating on content, if we can really kind of think about this core idea of what is the digital future that we want, how can the technologies we make work towards ideals and progress and increase inclusivity, that I think that that we can maybe use technology as well to have more healthy attitudes towards positivity, social cohesion, and not division, polarization, and also important attitudes towards what it means to live, love, and explore one's mind in the 21st century. So yeah, thank you all.